let's face it, popular culture hasn't exactly been kind to our ancestors. Why they're always depicted with beards, I don't know. They had copious amounts of flint, which is even sharper than modern day scalpels. But in recent years, there has been some attempt to try and reinvent them and give them a little bit more humanity than previously. But I think it's time for our ancestors for a little bit more of reinvention. I'd like you to consider the following. These are mummies which were found in China. They're exceptionally well preserved, including all of the fabrics that they were buried with. But let's hear what the scientists have to say about these mummies.
The scan enabled her to construct a computer image of how the fabric looked when new. The result was incredible. The cloth was woven in a twill, similar to samples found in Europe dating back 3,000 years.
I was really kind of awestruck. A twill weave is something we're all familiar with. It's the same as in your blue jeans. What intrigued me about this fabric was not only that it's a twill weave, which is characteristically European and not characteristically Chinese, although the Chinese did have the technology for it, was also the coloration. The pattern of color usage on the field of the cloth is what we call plaid, or actually possibly even some kind of a tartan.
And this is how the newspapers reported this, which is what newspapers do, I suppose. But if we look here on the top left, we can actually see a form of knitting. It's an early form of knitting called null binding. It was known in Scandinavia in the time of the Vikings. And on the bottom left, you can see a lady wearing a jersey that's been knitted using this technique. In many cases, you would have to be quite knowledgeable about knitting to be able to distinguish between this is, two knitting needle type knitting or nail binding. But what we do know is that the Neolithic people did have these types of pins. We found many of them. They also had spindle whorls. We can see a spindle whorl which still actually has some of the wool that's already been spun on it. So we know the Neolithic were capable of taking a sheep and turning it into a ball of wool. And they had they obviously could, using loom weights and a system as shown in the photograph there, they were more than capable of knitting, of weaving fabric. But the question remains, did they knit? Well, they had everything that they would require to knit, except we haven't actually found any knitting from the Neolithic. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they weren't able to knit. It's just that we haven't found it. Knitting doesn't really survive very well. But perhaps when we think next time of the Neolithic and the Vikings, rather than thinking like this, after a hard day's pillaging and raping, they would have gone home and took off their horned helmets and the bone through their nose and slipped into something a little bit more comfortable. So perhaps we should think of the Neolithic farmers and the Vikings more like this. It's just an aside. Now, a word about the so-called domesticated animals that the Neolithic farmers first brought to Britain around about 4000 BCE. I'd like you to watch this clip here about a group of cattle down in England at Chippingham. It's rather interesting.
And they caught the red deer, but they also caught these cattle. And the mystery is, what were the cattle doing roaming around here when we know that cattle have been domesticated in this country for at least 5,000 years, possibly 6. So why were the cattle in the woods? No one really knows. The cattle have been here for about 800 years and more, and for the first few hundred years of their existence here, they served no agricultural purpose really. What they were here for was hunting and to be hunted. So they needed them wild. Last thing you want if you're going out hunting an animal and trying to prove how tough and manly you are is something that's tame. You want something that's stroppy.
So perhaps the first cattle that were introduced into Britain at the beginning of the Neolithic were less like Daisy aimlessly chewing the cud in the field, looking at you as you drive past, but more like these. And these cattle are not to be messed with. You get too close to these, they will attack you, no question. An earlier programme I saw about them, the Guardian or the Warden was saying that he believed that they were a cross between the aurochs and the first oxen that were introduced into Britain at the beginning of the Neolithic. But science will maybe clarify that point in future days. Although it should be noted that if they were to dart one of these cattle to administer some emergency medication or whatever, and once it woke up and it wandered back into the herd would kill it. They will smell the humans on the cattle, and they just will not stand for it. So, perhaps when we consider the earliest cattle, we should think more like the Native Americans rather than herding buffalo, they are following the herd. The same could be said for the Siberians and the reindeers. Indeed, I don't know how, but I think these wallabies escaped from some place in the Highlands of Scotland, and they're not farmed, but they survive quite happily, completely wild. Occasionally, in the depths of really bad winters, the locals feel sorry for them and they'll go and dig them out of the snow and give them some hay. But invariably, they're quite happy living their lives in the Highlands of Scotland. The same's true of the early sheep. In the top right hand corner we can see the Cheviot sheep, which was developed in the borders of England and Scotland around about the beginning of the 1800s. It produces a decent quality wool and a decent quality meat. Prior to that time, sheep were raised for their meat or for their wool. This Cheviot sheep could do both, and it was so successful and so popular, about a third of all of the species of sheep at that time died out. Now, unfortunately, the value of a fleece today is less than the cost to actually shear it. So many of the farmers in Scotland are going back to the old breeds, like the Soay sheep and the McGregor sheep in the top left. And you can see the Soay sheep, they don't need shear. They lose their fleece by themselves. It does make them look a little bit skrecky, though, I must admit.
A few of these had been brought across to the main island of Herta at the evacuation. Relics of the original domestic sheep of Britain, now replaced everywhere else by better breeds. In St Kilda's empty years, the Surrey flock grew rapidly to form the only flock of wild sheep in Britain, totally unshepherded and left to find their own level of population.
The Neolithic peoples were already in France and Belgium by about 5000 BCE. They didn't cross the Channel or indeed go any further north into Scandinavia until about 4000 BCE. Why that is, we're unsure, but when they did eventually cross the Channel and go into Britain, they very quickly colonised the whole of Britain and Ireland within a couple of hundred years. We can also say about the islands, obviously we don't find many boats from the Neolithic. However, it's mooted that they possibly would have had boats a little bit like the Corach that we can see in the bottom middle. It's basically a frame onto which hide is spread and then some form of waterproofing, pitch pine, etc. Pine tar was spread over it to give it waterproof ability. As I said, from such an early date, very little survives. But if we look on the right-hand side, this is the Lurgan canoe. It's well over 18 metres long. These are huge boats. More importantly, although we don't have sort of proof that they did actually have boats, what we can say is that, for example, if we look down at the map of Scotland on the bottom right, you've got the Isle of Lewis, Ailen Lewis. They find red deer. Now, the red deer, they've done genetic tests on them, and they did come from the mainland Scotland. However, it's too far for the red deer to get there by themselves. Indeed, it's too far for humans to get there by themselves. So they're pretty certain that the early Neolithic farmers, they were actually bringing red deer onto the Outer Hebrides with a view to, it's a form of farming, although red deer have never been domesticated. We can also see in Coll and Oronsay. Coll means hazelnut in Gaelic, and we find these huge middens on Coll and in Oronsay of hazelnuts. We also find other, shell middens of limpets and periwinkles on Oronsay. They themselves date right the way back to the Mesolithic, as far back as 8000 BCE. Now, once again, finding boats from the Mesolithic is even more difficult. However, if they are able to travel to these places, then undoubtedly they must have had boats. There's no way of getting around that. I've put some links to some of the information about it. Up in the top right hand corner, you can actually see one of the shell middens. I think that one's from Oronsay. Highland cows, or Hieland coos as they're called here in Scotland. Fearsome looking, but yet timorous beasts. They actually come in a variety of colours, although for some reason ginger seems to be the most popular nowadays. But certainly the texts that we have from the 17 and 1800s state quite clearly that in the Highlands of Scotland, and indeed even in Wales, invariably the cattle were coloured black. Also, the cattle from the 17 and 1800s would have been as much as 15 to 20% smaller than they are today. Correct term for them is a fold of cattle, simply because they would build enclosures called folds into which the cattle could take refuge during the worst of the snowstorms in the winter, and to give them some protection from the predation of animals like wolves. Other qualities, obviously over the millennium, these cattle have developed a very thick coat of hair, which to protect from the winter. And what this does is the beef that comes from Highland cattle is much lower in fat and cholesterol, higher in protein and iron than beef from other cattle. Also, the long hairy fringe on their actually protects their eyes from midges and other insects in the Highlands of Scotland. And as a breed, they suffer an awful lot less from problems with their eyes than other cattle types. They're also extremely good mothers. They can continue bearing calves as late as 18 years old. They're very long lived. The calves themselves, invariably, they hide them in the long grass and far away from, they wander around, which makes it difficult for the local farmers to know whether or not their cows have calved, because the calves are so well hidden. But this excellent protective nature of these cattle can even extend to the sheep that are grazing in the same areas as them. But the earliest form of cattle pastoralism was what they call transhumance, and it was practiced all over Europe. It still is in some places, especially in the north of Italy. Basically, the cattle would be kept down in the lower glens next to where the people invariably lived. And you can see in the top right here what they call in Scotland a button ben. On the left-hand side of that picture, you can see the byre, or the butt, which is butting up against the croft or the ben, and the animals would live in there in the depths of winter. But on the left-hand side, we can see a much older butt and ben with a tough roof. The tough roof would have been cut and it would have been dried out during the winter by burning peat inside the butt and ben. And in the summer they would replace it, and the turf that was on the roof would be then used as fuel during the winter. One thing to notice here is there is no chimneys on this early butt and ben. They didn't arrive in Scotland until much, much later. Effectively, the smoke would have just risen up and seeped through the thatch of sods of peat, and it would have helped to keep down the midges inside. Also, there's no separate building butting up against this bothy. The cattle themselves would have actually lived inside, perhaps 1/3 penned off for the cattle to live in during the winter. It protected the cattle, but also the heat that was given out by the cattle would also heat the people living inside. Still very common when visiting people in Scotland. If rather than saying "come on in," they will say "come awa ben hoose," although they no longer ask you to wipe your feet. It's also mooted by some scientists that this close proximity that the Europeans had with their animals, they developed an immunity to a lot of the diseases that were inherent in such a lifestyle. So much so that when the first Europeans went over to the Americas, it's been mooted that perhaps it was these, the Native Americans succumbed partly because of this lack of immunity to such close proximity and such diseases. I think that's still to be clarified, but it makes a certain amount of sense. Either way, in the spring, the cattle would be let loose into the fields, and then the manure inside the butt would be taken out and spread across the field to fertilise the ground. And before the crops started to grow, they would then be shifted up into what they call sheilings. Sheilings are much simpler buildings, simpler constructions of buildings, but higher up in the hills in areas where they could pasture the cattle in the spring and the summer. Away from the crops down in the glen below. How old are they? It's difficult to know, but looking at these ones here, they remind me a lot of Skara Brae. Because it's dry stone walling, it's difficult to know exactly how old they are, or indeed how often they've been repaired or reused. I suspect that it's probably they date back to the Neolithic as well. Just a matter of interest, this is the number of sheilings that are just in the east of Scotland. There are literally thousands of them, and I haven't done the area between the Don and the Dee, but they're everywhere. One of the effects of driving the cattle up to the higher pastures in the spring is you can see on this map the verdant green trails that are going between the higher brown hills, if you wish. This is the cattle being driven up, and their manure is actually fertilising the ground and creating, lots of very good quality grass for the cattle as they move up to the upland pastures, and also as they're coming back down. I'm going to end this video here. In the next video, I'm going to take you on an actual drove from the Outer Hebrides across Scotland, down through the Highlands and into England, but also from Wales into England too. If you like these videos, please subscribe and hit the notification. And if enough people do, perhaps I'll create a Patreon site where people can get access to this particular KLM file for Google Earth.